Morning and welcome to Words That Matter, a modern day book club. I'm the host of Words That Matter, Lee Smith. A very special guest this morning, very special show. Something that a lot of people aren't only talking about, but a lot of people are living as different habitats, as different parts of the country seem to become more and more hostile to freedom. Whether we're talking about people still thinking about the COVID lockdowns, whether people are thinking about how American cities appear to be collapsing, whether it's New York, Chicago, San Francisco, people are looking for not only security for their families, they're also looking for freedom. And our guest today has written a fundamentally important piece of research. They're on their seventh edition. The seventh edition of Freedom in the 50 States, and its author is head of the American Institute for Economic Research, Mr. William Ruger. Will, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I just wanted to, I want to understand what, so you started this project long before COVID, long before American cities started to collapse the way they are now. So what inspired you to do this? And actually, I want to talk about what the actual index does and what it looks like. But first, why was it important for you to document freedom in the 50 states?
Yeah, so my co-author and I, Jason Sorens, we're both political scientists, right? We are interested in social science questions, political economy, and so there's a definitely an angle there, just about a kind of innate curiosity to know what is the state of freedom around the country. But it's also that we are interested in social change, right? We hope that people will value freedom as much as we do, and maybe we could provide some tools for them to use this, whether it's individuals thinking about moving, whether it's businesses thinking about relocating, or whether it's legislative staffers across the states that want to see how they might improve their own, policy environment in the various states. So there's a lot of different uses for this, and we're happy to provide this data. And again, as social scientists, we're eager to also know, like, what effect does freedom have? Does it impact economic growth, as Adam Smith might have argued in The Wealth of Nations, right? Does it impact, whether people make decisions about where they live, right? Like, is it only they move because they move to Florida because of good weather, or does the policy environment in Florida compared to where they live matter for why they're moving? And so we kind of have that kind of inherent curiosity.
Well, Florida is one of the top states, number 2 in the 7th edition. Has Florida's place changed at all over your several editions? Yeah, I mean, is there a lot of movement in the index?
Yeah, in the 5th edition, Florida was number 1. And it's not that Florida has done worse since. It's that New Hampshire has leapfrogged it in terms of its status of freedom. In fact, New Hampshire has the highest recorded absolute freedom measure in the history of the index, over 7 editions and 15 years. And so, again, it's not always that states do absolutely worse if they fall. It's that they may just be leapfrogged by someone doing relatively better.
Well, can you talk about what the absolute, what do you mean by absolute freedom? So I guess I'm curious,
Sure.
like how you compute the rankings.
Yeah, I mean, we start like good social scientists with saying, hey, let's operationalize or define our variable, right? So what does freedom mean? And we take a very American understanding of freedom. It's very traditional. It should not be that controversial, right? It's that people should have the ability to dispose or use their life, liberty, and property as they see fit, consistent with the equal rights of others, right? So it's not as if people can do anything they want, swing their arms about wildly and hit people, right? Or drive their cars into people's houses or property, right? It's that they can do what they will with themselves and their property, their resources, as long as they're not directly harming others, people's equal rights. And once we do that, we say, okay, well, what are the policy variables? What are the policy regimes that actually impact freedom as we define it? And so we look at about 230 different types of policies, and we code them based on their respect or lack of respect for people's freedoms. And then what we do is we have a certain weighting scheme in which we look at the the cost to those who are not able to enjoy that freedom, and we weight the policies that way. So it's an objective weighting of the different variables or policies. And then we, call balls and strikes. We, look at how, in an additive way, what does it look like? Who does well when across the board? And in terms of that weighting scheme, uh, freedom is a totality, as Milton Friedman talked about in Capitalism and Freedom, his famous book. But we do break it down by economic freedom and personal freedom, or freedom from paternalism. And then even economic freedom is subdivided into fiscal policy and regulatory policy. And the long and the short of it is that fiscal policy, regulatory policy, and personal freedom are all worth about a third of the index. And so that's how it's constructed. And again, when you have 230 variables, you might disagree or agree with us on one thing or another. But it's a pretty robust data set when you're talking about that many variables. And we think that it's the best, not only the best overall index, and it's the only comprehensive index of freedom that's available right now in the country. But we also think it's the best measure of economic freedom. And there are some competitors, and we're happy to have other measures out there, but we think it's the most robust. And one thing that is interesting is that one of our competitors also had the same view of New Hampshire, and so we feel like, for example, that our top score we're pretty on to, we think we're on the target, if you will.
Well, so let me ask, how did New Hampshire leapfrog Florida?
Well, it's already starting from a very high base, and it was number one in the 6th edition as well. I mean, look, this is a state that just has very broad freedoms across the board. They don't just do well in economic freedom or in personal freedom. I mean, there are states, think about Texas. Texas is number 6 on economic freedom, but it's number 50 on personal freedom, and that's why it only comes in 17th. Whereas a state like New Hampshire is good across the board. And, that means that everything from relatively low tax burden to relatively low government consumption as a percentage of GDP to relatively high levels of respect for things like gun rights, low incarceration rate relative to their, personal and property crime levels, relatively high respect for educational freedom. So again, across the board, relatively good scores. I mean, they could do better in regulatory policy, but again, compared to other states, they have so much respect for freedom that they clearly swamp others, and even do better than Florida, which, again, it's really kind of has been neck and neck for years between those two states.
So a lot of people, well, I won't speak for a lot of people. I'll speak for myself. I'm surprised to hear that Texas is only 17th for personal freedoms. So what are the sort of personal freedoms that Texas isn't great on?
Yeah, it's even worse than that. They're number 50 on personal freedom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. I'm sorry. There's 17 all around. Okay. Yeah, that's really surprising then. How did Texas get to be 50th in personal freedom?
Well, for one thing, they have a very high crime-adjusted incarceration rate, and have traditionally had very high levels of victimless crime arrest rates, for example, and drug arrest rates. This is one of the reasons why actually conservatives in Texas have led the way towards criminal justice reform. I mean, this was not something that was promoted by the far left. And again, it's not like they were asking for defunding the police or something, but they knew. Rick Perry, for example, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, what's called Right on Crime. These are organizations and individuals who understood that Texas had this problem, and for a variety of reasons, but also not just because it's right to do, but also because, look, it's very expensive to have high incarceration rates. And so even conservatives in Texas have tried to reform things, and that has helped. But they still have a very high crime-adjusted level of incarceration. They also, unlike other states, including Florida, Arizona, in New Hampshire, they have not reformed educational choice. You just have not seen the kind of backpack funding approach or school choice approach that you've seen in some other states, and that means that they fall behind. They have had some improvements in terms of gun rights respect over the years. But it used to be when we first started this study that, Texas had, even their gun rights policies were not what you would expect. In fact, I think at one point Vermont was even higher rated on respect for gun freedom than Texas. So
Wow.
again, it could do a
Oh,
lot
wow.
better in a variety of areas.
Yeah, that's very surprising. I'm sure a lot of people would be shocked to hear that. Okay, so
Yeah, I mean, there's other things too, like gambling, marijuana reform just hasn't really happened in a place like Texas.
wow.
And so, it's not just one thing or another. Maybe you don't like guns, but look, they haven't done well in education, gambling, marijuana, criminal justice. And so, again, these are issues that are kind of left and right coded, if you will.
Right.
So I think both liberals and conservatives could say that Texas could do a lot better on personal freedom.
Wow. So I guess a lot of people would not be surprised to see that New York is number 50. I imagine though that California and New York have vied for the bottom spot over the years. How did New York get, again, people would not be surprised, but how did it get so low? And why is California clearly one of the most beautiful parts of the world? Why are they so bad too?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is a policy ideology that is paternalistic across the board, right? They want to tell New Yorkers and Californians what to do when it comes to a lot of different areas of life. Think about restrictions and regulations on homeschoolers or private schools, the lack of educational choice. You think about they haven't had the best gun rights over the years, although that's changed with some Supreme Court decisions where they're, kind of forced to be better. If you think about, problems on the fiscal policy side, I mean, New York's state and local tax burden combined is twice that of places like New Hampshire and Florida. So
Wow.
there's just a lot more that the legislature is doing to both restrict your freedom and to dig into your wallet, which ultimately is a restriction on freedom, right? If the state is conscripting your resources that you have worked hard to earn, that's a form of coercion and paternalism. And again, we're not anarchists. We don't believe there should be no government, but these spending levels are so high relative to other states that you really wonder what's going on there, especially because it's not as if these places are offering such better services to their citizens.
Do you see, I mean, have businesses responded? I mean, we know that a lot of businesses are moving out of California and they've gone to Texas. So I guess, is that surprising they've gone to Texas? Well, if you had a business and you were located in California or New York, where would you go? Of course, we could burrow down in particular businesses. I saw that Remington, I believe it's Remington Arms, moved from New York State to Georgia. So certainly, weapons manufacturers would find a more conducive business atmosphere in a place like Georgia for a whole bunch of different reasons. But generally, yeah, if you had a business in New York or California, where would you be looking to move?
Yeah. Now, again, there's a lot of reasons why businesses are going to choose one place or another. I mean, a big factor is what's the human capital like where they operate. And so if you're in high tech, there are really good reasons to be in California because of the density of tech workers. But on the margins, freedom matters. And I would look to places that had that. So one of the reasons why Texas is still attracting people is because it does really well when it comes to economic freedom, right? It's a top state for economic freedom, despite its problems in personal freedom. It's a right to work state. It still has relatively low state tax burden and government consumption. And so that's one of the reasons it's attractive. So I think, like I said, Texas is, I think, number 6 on economic freedom, which means it does well on fiscal and regulatory policy. And that's very attractive to places. In fact, there's a significant correlation between economic freedom and personal income growth. And so people are attracted to that and attracted to a lower regulatory environment. But it's not just, say, a place like Texas or Florida. It's also if you're the best in your region. So a place like Indiana, for example, can do well relative to, say, Ohio or especially Illinois, because in its region, it offers a better mix of policies that are attractive to businesses and individuals. Same thing in the Northeast, where you have New Hampshire surrounded by states like Vermont and Maine that are a lot less free, and also Massachusetts. although Massachusetts isn't as bad as most people think. It's not a bottom 5 state. The bottom 5 states are states like, again, New York, Hawaii, California, New Jersey, and Oregon. Those are the worst.
Do the bottom 5 states, well, they know it, and presumably they want it, but are they at all concerned? Is there any urgency at all with Gavin Newsom, Kathy Hochul, to change the way things are going and to stop people from leaving the state, businesses as well as individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is a little complicated because there's two things. One is part of the reason these states have these policy regimes is because of the policy ideology or political culture of the state, and especially of the elites who run these states. And so, look, it's not surprising when progressives like to see rent control, legislation, even though rent control is actually really bad. Economists writ large understand the dangers of rent control and what it does for the quantity and quality of housing. But they're Baptists, if you will. They're religious about it. But it's also, and I should have said this about New York and California earlier, it's also the power of concentrated interests in these states, because it's not just Baptists, if you will, it's also bootleggers, right? And meaning that these are concentrated interests who benefit from these types of government control and paternalism. And so if there's one example we have where I think it's Oregon or Washington, in which they have relatively low wine taxes, but they have high spirits taxes. Well, if this was merely Baptist, you'd think that they, would like to have high taxes on all of these quote unquote sinful products. But actually, it's the concentrated interest of the wine industry keeping spirits, taxes high, favors their industry. And you could argue the same thing is probably happening in a state like Kentucky.
If a business would go one place, for individuals, like, have you asked about this or said, well, look, where should I go? We're tired of living in Washington, D.C. Things seem to be falling apart here. It's too expensive. Our taxes are high. Where do you suggest people move to?
Again, people are going to make a lot of decisions. They care about cost of living. They care about amenities, beaches, mountains. They care about the weather. They care about, whether this is a place that, kind of suits their interests. A lot of people will move to a place like New York because they like the dynamism of that city that still remains. But again, on the margins, the fact is that people are moving for freedom, and we see that, right? So a place like New York has lost residents consistently now for decades. And even in the just last few years has lost about 3.4% of its population. That's a huge cost. And one of the things that we would hope for is that, given there is a statistically significant relationship between freedom and what's called outmigration, that even progressives might have to worry that they're going to erode their tax base and not be able to afford all these government programs if they keep pushing people out. And that's one of the virtues of our federal system, is that people can vote with their feet, which betters their own life. But in a way, when people leave their state, it actually betters the lives of the people, in some ways, in the long run, we think, of the people who remain, because there is pressure on government, if they don't free themselves, they're going to burrow further and further down into decline. And that's what I think that New York should worry about. And again, they're trading on a lot of I think, kind of old capital, if you will, which is why it hasn't gone completely south. But the fact is that upstate New York, unfortunately, has a lot more in common with some of the more poorer areas of our country than we might imagine, largely because of that policy regime. It's anti-growth and overall, I think, anti-human progress.
Wow. Do you think the government of New York State is responding to it, or they're
I think they're highly ideological, but there are limits, right? And look, you've seen places that historically, internationally, for example, the UK and New Zealand, for example, they were going down a path to ruin in many ways due to government policies, and they had to reform because there is a kind of feedback loop. And this is one of the reasons why it's good if the federal government doesn't bail out states, because We want states to have to suffer the cost of their bad behavior because that will induce change. And if the federal government were going to bail out states, then that would introduce what's called in economics moral hazard, right? And that moral hazard would lead to continual ruin. And what's worse is we would all have to pay for bad policies that in theory benefit people in other states like California and New York, but really benefit mostly concentrated interests there.
Wow. Will, what I want to ask is, and we're gonna go away for about a minute here. Everyone who's watching on YouTube, please make the jump. Come back and see us exclusively on Epoch TV. We're going to come back with Will Ruger. One of the things that I want to find out about is, are people moving around enough so that we're actually seeing, I don't know if we talk about a divided country, but we're seeing that people are further separating into red and blue. And I want to know what that looks like. And we're going to get right into that as soon as we return. Again, we'll be back in less than a minute. See you in a sec. Hasn't Congressman Stewart written a few novels too?
I pitched the idea to him to write because he's a prolific writer. I said, so what do you think? You interested in writing it? He goes, nope, you're going to write it. He said, yeah, you're going to write it. He said, go home, write 50 pages and send it to me. And I will be brutally honest with you. The next few days, I finally turned out 50 pages, and I saw him in, another week or whatever. And he says, now I told you I was going to be brutally honest. You got to keep doing it. Send me another 50 pages. I love it.
Wow. Not every congressman that writes a novel. Writing a novel is a hard thing and a difficult thing. And while you're serving your constituents at the same time.
And believe it or not, most of it was written in an airplane.